This screencast will show you how to use Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator to lay out industrial design presentation boards. I'm going to use A3, so I'm setting up the document in Illustrator for A3, and I'm also going to use a 10mm grid with 10 subdivisions. That's 1mm subdivisions. Next, I'm going to make the grid visible and add some guides. I'm going to set up 20mm borders for my A3 page. Good large borders, generous borders, make the page seem less crowded and more pleasing to the eye. Creating a simple title block at the top of the page, I've coloured it red, and I'm naming my artboard Panel 1. I'm going to make a number of artboards as I work my way through the presentation. Now I'm putting some rectangular lines down, and I'm exporting the Illustrator file as a Photoshop file. And in Photoshop, I'm going to import that file and use it as the guide for laying out the page. So I've opened the scan of some of my concept sketches. I've done these on bleed-proof marker paper, and now I'm using the levels dialog box to adjust the white point and the black point. So I want the lines to be black and the rest of the page to be pure white. So I've got a good contrast. I'm doing the same for all of the scans. Here I'm adjusting I'm adjusting the levels of the Canson paper illustrations, and one at a time, each one adjusting the levels. So I want a good level of contrast, and I want to make sure my blacks are black and the white highlights are white, or at least very close to white. I'm also repairing some of the test marks I made on the Canson paper simply by clicking and dragging a selection over the top of those marks, and that's made the page whole. Now I'm using this Illustrator image in Photoshop, and I've used it as a separate layer called Layout, and now I'm going to start working on the scan of one of my sketches, and I'm doing this by cutting out, using cut and paste, each of the separate images on the page that I want to treat as a unit, and I've made them into their own layer. So when you cut and paste, pasting automatically makes a new layer. Keep track of those layers by naming them, and this avoids confusion as you go, and switch off layers that you don't need so that you can see what you're working on. So you can see I've had most of the layers are turned off, and here I'm just turning them on again, and I can see the elements that I'm going to work with. Some of those layers are invisible because I've decided not to use them. So I've also used the layer settings to use set to darken, so that I can see the lines over each other and the white pixels become transparent. Now I've switched back to Illustrator, and I'm going to import that Photoshop composition, that set of drawings, into my Illustrator document. Before I do that, I'm just setting up some layers in Illustrator as well. So here I am placing the first presentation sheet of drawings, and I've placed that into Illustrator onto the sketches layer, the images layer I think I called it. Now I'm making title block, and as I've said in previous screencasts, I like to use a single font family for my lettering, and I think this creates a unified look. And I've used Titanium, which is available in a range of different weights, and so I like to use bold for the major headings and thin and normal for the text. So here I'm adding the title information. Now this is set at only 10 point, so it's going to be quite small on the page. I think that's fine. This information needs to be on the page. Who you are, what the project is, that kind of stuff is essential. You should make it part of every page composition, but it should be small. It's not the major information. Here I'm giving a page number, and here we go. Just about finished that sheet. So I just need to add some text. Again, I'm using the same font family, but here I'm using a regular setting, and it's always good to space out your paragraphs by adjusting paragraph spacing rather than adding blank returns. Blank lines don't look so professional, so use the paragraph spacing if you can. Okay, so what I'm looking for is a pleasing page composition. Now I'm going to duplicate that artboard, ready to add my second page. So I've done that in Photoshop. I didn't bore you with doing that in detail. I've just placed it into Illustrator and I'm adding text notes. Now here I'm adding a title for the Samsung camera that I sketched, and I've noticed that I've written that by hand in the illustration, in the sketch that I did earlier. So that's a bit repetitious, so I think I need to fix that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch to Photoshop and erase that line, that handwritten line of text. So I'm back in Photoshop, and here I'm just erasing that title. You can see it's now gone. And I'm switching back to Illustrator, and Illustrator automatically asks me if I'd like to update it. And I say yes, and that text has disappeared. So that updating is very useful. So you can work quite seamlessly between the two programs. Now I've switched back to Photoshop to work on my Canson sheet, and one of the things I did when I was scanning my Canson drawings is I scanned a blank sheet of Canson paper, and this becomes a simple background for any of the cut and paste work that I do as I'm rearranging these images. Now, bear in mind that the ideal situation is to scan your page of sketches and use them unmodified. You don't need to rearrange every image on the page. It's really a matter of how far you want to take this, how much the page was originally in need of reorganization. And as you get more experienced, you won't have to do that so much. But I've tried to show this example as a more extreme case where I've tended to do quite a lot of reorganization on the page, removed some images and enlarged others, and even in this case erased some simple line work that I didn't want to appear. I felt it was a little bit cluttered. So I've done a fair bit of reorganization on this page of Canson sketching. And I think it makes the page a little bit clearer and a little bit easier to read. So doing a bit of, I'm using the rubber stamp tool to paint over with the background paper texture, and I'm using layers to reorganize, move things around. When I want to block out something, I've generally used layer masks. A layer mask hides part of a layer, and that's non-destructive, so you can basically recover the bits that you've erased. They're not actually deleted, they're just hidden. So that's a very flexible way of working, and if you change your mind about something, it's easy to fix it up. Now here I'm using the magic lasso. I've decided that I want this sketch to overlay very closely one of the others, so I'm using the magic lasso, and you can change the tolerance, and also switching the visibility of the mask to make it easier to fine-tune it. I don't want any little fragments showing through, so I'm switching between the visibility of the mask and I'm using the paintbrush to paint away that mask or add to it as needed. And here we are, I'm using a layer mask again, and now I've got a very close cutout which allows me to layer that layer over other images on the page. Now you can see there's a bit of a mismatch between the background Canson paper and the sketches that I've been working on. You can see the sketches are a little bit lighter, and that's because I adjusted the levels on that sketch earlier, and it doesn't quite match the background sheet. So one of the last things I'm going to do is adjust the levels of the background sheet. I'm going to zoom in so I can see some of these margins, and I'm adjusting the background layer, that Canson sheet, so that I can see almost no difference. See, that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to move around the page and just see if there are any other regions where that difference is noticeable. You can also switch preview on and off to compare the difference of the levels dialog box and make sure it's doing some job. So I'm pretty happy with that. It's not seamless, but most people wouldn't notice, and that's good enough for a concept presentation. Now switch back to Illustrator again. Going to drop that image in. Now I'm very aware that I'm going to be using an A3 color printer, and it won't print right to the edge of the page. So one of the things I want to do is add a margin, and I've done that by masking the layer. Now switch back to Photoshop again. I'm going to add some white highlights to the Canson paper. I didn't add white highlights with paint in my original sketch because I was planning to do this in Photoshop. I've created a new layer and I'm painting the white highlights directly onto this new layer. This means I can erase individual highlights or all of them just by controlling that layer. It's very, very flexible. So I'm using the paintbrush in airbrush mode so I can spray on this white paint and add to highlights where I think they're needed. And you can go overboard on this, so it's something you want to watch out. You want to have some good contrast, but you don't want to make it look like it's kind of lens flare all over the place. Now I've decided that I want to add some darker tones behind the objects, and I'm just adding these on another layer and erasing them away to reveal the actual drawings themselves. So I've oversprayed them and then erasing back, and you can adjust the contrast, the transparency, the opacity in fact of that layer to adjust how dark or bright it is. And I've made it quite light so that I can see what I'm erasing, and there you can see how dark it is. So I've added a bit of black tone to the background to make the foreground elements stand out. Switch back to Illustrator and it's automatically asked if I want to update that imported image. Added some text headings, labels and notation, and then I'm back in Photoshop to work on my main Canson illustration. Again, I start with adjusting the layers and then I'm going to do my highlights. Again with the airbrush tool, adding some highlights here and there on a separate layer, and then this works really well for things like lenses, where you can really get that nice sense of transparency and reflections inside the lens assembly. It's a really nice effect. And of course, as I did for the previous Canson sheet, I'm also going to add some dark tones to make the object stand out from the background paper. So again, I'm overspraying on a new layer and then erasing using either the erasing tool or a layer mask to get rid of some of that tone so that it shows through. Again, those layer masks are really a very flexible way to paint, so you can switch between painting with black and painting with white on the layer mask, and you hit the X key on your keyboard to switch between black and white. It's very, very quick and a nice way of editing. So I'm liking the look of that. All I've got to do is bring it into Illustrator. Ooh, I might just add some more brightness to these secondary highlights, and bring that into Illustrator and mask off the edges, and we've almost finished. So here we are, positioning, creating a mask, clipping mask, and adding some text, and the presentation is pretty much ready. So those white margins will make it easy to print on any color printer, and they won't make those unsightly narrow white margins that you get when you don't plan for the printer that you're using. And there we have the 4-page A3 presentation board. Quite easy using the two programs.